you're essentially an enemy of the state right now.
I think he's guilty of treason.
Just tweeted all caps treason.
The president equates dissent with treason. My crime was criticizing Donald Trump. Granted, I did it relentlessly.
Dropped a political bombshell.
Paranoia and suspicion erupting at the White House.
Now everyone, of course, wonders who wrote this op-ed.
He accused me of the highest crime in the U.S. Constitution, punishable by death, because I argued he shouldn't be reelected, because I told the American people about how bad it was inside the Trump administration.
An extraordinary article
Written by some anonymous source.
Who is it?
The rule of law is dead in the United States.
What's left? Back again, not in the stew. Man's in Montreal, Canada, for a Organizers of Attention Govern or Be Governed conference. This is bringing together progressive minds from all across the world to discuss what do we do with an AI and technological revolution being led right now by the populist right. I've got something really special for you. A bunch of interviews with some of the leading thinkers in this space trying to figure out what is left of our political institutions during this period of unprecedented technological change.
I did for a good cause.
Do you think I'm going to get blacklisted for doing this?
The former Homeland Security official who once detailed his observations inside the first Trump administration in an anonymous op-ed, now accused of leaking classified information and treason.
According to Taylor, the Trump administration has found ways big and small to upend his life.
Mr. Anonymous, at once upon a time, you were the person who wrote this incredible op-ed in 2019 towards the end of the first Trump administration, which by all accounts upset the apple cart inside MAGA. You were a Republican, it's right to say, but your politics, I guess, were always kind of on that side of the aisle. But it was your exposure, am I right in saying, Miles, to almost authoritarian bent towards power that made you think, actually, what I care about is democracy first?
Yeah. Well, yeah, look, I mean, as you say, I'm a lifelong Republican. I came up in the GOP and went into government after 9/11 for a very simple reason, like a lot of people did. I wanted to make sure a day like that never happened again. And, you know, that took me from the Pentagon to the White House to Capitol Hill. And I worked in all these places, first for George W. Bush when he was president. And then when Donald Trump won, he was certainly not the person I wanted to win the Republican nomination or the presidency, because we all saw who he was. But once he did win, you know, a lot of us who had worked in the Bush administration felt like he needed experienced people in his departments and agencies running those places, because Donald Trump had never served in government and most of the people around him hadn't. It won't surprise you that I went into that administration at the Department of Homeland Security and saw a total nightmare. I mean, the administration was being operated not like the most powerful country in the world, but like a crowded New York bagel shop. I mean, it was a catastrophe. And as the months went on in the administration, it became clear that most of the president's cabinet was worried about his stability and his fitness for office. I mean, every one of us was exposed at some point to this. The recklessness of his decision-making, the impulsiveness, but also the inclination toward illegality. He always wanted to do things that were unconstitutional and couldn't be done. So you needed to have a little bit of a backbone to say no to the president. And people like to think I would speak truth to power. But when you're sitting in there in the Oval Office of the White House and the president says, I need you to do X, Y, Z, you don't know if you're really going to be able to say, no, Mr. President, in a moment like that. And most people are not. So as this is happening in the administration, as people are meeting the president for the first time, getting illegal directives, that concern is growing. And by the time we got to year 2 of the administration, it was clear that saying no to the president was no longer enough. And that even if you told him, Mr. President, you can't do this, it's illegal, he would try to do it anyway. And I fully expected any number of those people who were Trump's immediate lieutenants, running his cabinet departments and agencies, would be the ones to quit and protest and go public and say, this is what's happening in the Trump administration. It's so bad, we've talked about the fact that we might have to invoke emergency constitutional powers to replace him. Because conversations like that did happen. And yet no one did. No one came forward. So I made a decision at the time, which was, I think I can wake up the American people to how serious this is if I write from within the administration and say the thing I wish all of my bosses were quitting their jobs and saying. And so I wrote this anonymous opinion piece in the New York Times. I knew doing it anonymously would draw attention. It's what the founding fathers in America did when they wrote their defense of the Constitution. They wrote it anonymously because they knew it would create a spectacle. But then I always felt like I needed to unmask myself and come forward to provide more detail, to explain what was really going on. So I eventually resigned from the administration, spent months out on the campaign trail in 2020 talking about how dangerous Donald Trump would be if reelected, how in a second term, all of the things we'd stopped him from doing in the first term that were illegal would come to fruition. And we're living that now.
And you've spoken about how you were almost worried that you legitimized his narrative in a way, right? Because the whole Trump was gaining legitimacy by saying that there's a deep state. They're preventing me from being able to do what I need to do on behalf of the people. Then an anonymous article comes out saying that we're trying to prevent Trump from doing what he wants to do, almost validating his narrative, right? In a certain way. Do you feel like what we've seen in terms of polarization is a doubling down effect for the average voter, right? If you were already sucked into a bit of MAGA beforehand, narratives like yours actually for that person just makes them double down in believing Trump and saying, hey, this guy is on our side. And, you know, the Mileses of this world don't believe in democracy.
Well, look, I mean, it starts with believing a lie. And the lie that Donald Trump told about people like me was they're trying to stop me from being president. Okay, that couldn't have been further from the truth. I cannot think of a single time in the White House Situation Room, the Oval Office, Air Force One, that Donald Trump directed us to do something lawful where we said no. Our job was to tell the president what could and couldn't be done. And if he wanted to do something that was going to break the law, tell him no. Every public servant should do that. Whether they're in a Trump administration or a Biden administration, that's what we hope our public servants do, is they abide by the law. Donald Trump spun that as these deep staters are trying to stop me from doing what I want. And unfortunately, a lot of people did believe him. And now you see the consequences of that. Many of the things that Donald Trump is now doing, that his people are letting him do, that the loyalists are letting him do, the courts are now finding are not legal. They're not compliant with the Constitution. They're not compliant with the United States Code. He's breaking the law almost every week because there's no one there to tell him no. And if that was the deep state, then I, for one, want the deep state back.
Right.
Right? But the scarier part to me is Donald Trump is now, ironically, creating his own deep state.
Right.
So the deep state never really existed. There was never a secret cabal of government agents conspiring to thwart the president. But today, Donald Trump is actively trying to do two things: purge the federal government of people who don't agree with him, and then restock those agencies with loyalists,
sycophants,
who will be in those jobs beyond his presidency, because many of those aren't political appointments. He is intentionally creating a deep state that never existed, a group of people to conspire to advance his agenda long after he's gone. That should be something that we focus on.
And if you think about the executive orders in particular, right, there's just been so many. Yeah. It's like the communication strategy of Steve Bannon, the idea of flooding the zone, has just been embodied now in running roughshod over the Constitution, over what executive power he can exercise. Is there anything that stands out? Because most of us in the UK or in Europe, or my listeners outside of the US, you know, we're just picking up bits and bobs here and there about things that he's done that are illegitimate. But is there one thing for you, or maybe two or three things that stand out as real signposts that we are in a time of complete authoritarian backsliding?
Yeah, well, look, this was always their plan. You know, before I quit the Trump administration in protest, I remember sitting with one of his top aides at the White House, Stephen Miller, in Stephen's office on the second floor of the White House.
He's a real human being.
Well, I mean,
that's not a lizard in a costume.
I don't think they've proven it yet. We'll see.
But he's so sinister, right? Like Stephen Miller is like the kind of, that's the person that I assume, kind of looking from the outside, is really pulling strings here.
Well, here's what he said to me at the time, which I think was revealing, is he looked at a drawer in his desk and he said, you know, in that drawer, I've got a stack of executive orders we will issue in a second term, and it will be a shock and awe blitz. He used the term a shock and awe blitz. Now, you got to ask yourself, is it ethical to have a stack of things that you wouldn't do in a first term because you know that if you did them, you would never get reelected, and to keep those secret from the American people? I think it's an obvious answer to the question, but that's what they did. They were planning to do their most extreme things in a second term when they wouldn't have to worry necessarily about the prospect of facing a free and fair election where Donald Trump might lose. And that's what they've done. And of that stack of orders, the most egregious thing hasn't happened yet, but we are right on the cusp of it. And that's the invocation of what's called the Insurrection Act. Put another way, it's the closest thing there is in the American system to martial law, to basically having the United States military take over the country. And unfortunately, under the law, the President of the United States has the ability to do that with a huge asterisk. And that asterisk is it can only happen in situations of insurrection or rebellion, when there's basically an effort to overthrow the federal government or an invasion of the United States. Fine. Then the president is allowed to take the military, put them on U.S. city streets, and enforce the law. And we've gotten close to that in the United States. The National Guard is out there, but they're prevented from enforcing the law. They're only allowed to go protect federal assets, federal buildings, federal agents. But we're really close to the president invoking that power to just run the country, basically, with the military. That's the thing people should be most worried about. And if that happens in the United States, it's going to be really, really hard to turn back from that. It will be a constitutional crisis in our country, but it will have enormous foreign policy, national security, and global economic implications.
And he's been flirting with this, right? Like with J.B. Pritzker and Trump were having a back and forth about Illinois and whether he needed to deploy the National Guard. So it's almost like he's baiting a situation. I mean, I think one of the big concerns that we have as outsiders was watching, the Charlie Kirk assassination, the response to that in rhetoric. Now, we don't even know what the kind of motivation was of that murderer, but it was almost as if, regardless of what the truth was, it was going to be politicized, right? It was going to be seen as this Antifa, this leftist, kind of ideological motivated form of terrorism that would naturally entreat a clampdown.
They are trying to provoke a violent response from the political opposition to justify that further crackdown. There's a term that circulates popularly in conspiracy theory circles, false flag.
Yeah,
right.
Everything's a false flag.
Everything's a false flag. Everyone thinks there's a psyop or a false flag.
Yeah.
And most of the time, those things aren't real. This is one of the few times I can think of in American history where you're witnessing an effort to generate a false flag, which is the deployment of these troops in democratic states and cities is meant to provoke some kind of violent response that allows the administration to do a deeper crackdown, allows them in the eyes of the public. So something so shocking to the conscience of the American people needs to happen in the view of the White House to be able to then lay down that trump card of the Insurrection Act and the deployment of troops across American cities. And you're absolutely right about the Kirk assassination. I mean, that's what a lot of people worried about would happen in the wake of it. And it's what it seems the administration is trying to do. And, look, the worry is, if you look at history, that tends to be pretty effective. When would-be autocrats try to intimidate the opposition, provoke the opposition, 99% of them are peaceful. But you always have a 1% that builds a makeshift Molotov cocktail, throws it at a police officer, and, after that, all bets are off. And I think that's what they're trying to make happen right now.
And if you think about your old department, the Department for Homeland Security, ICE, who we've all now become familiarized with, live within that department, have they almost become like Trump's militia in a way? Is that the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah. Trump has always wanted his own police force that's accountable to him. That sounds kind of crazy. It's literally what he had said before. In fact, there were multiple occasions in the first Trump administration where the president had reportedly tasked aides at the White House with figuring out how to create his own private military force. So, he knew that Russian President Vladimir Putin had something called the Wagner Group, that was a, group of mercenaries that went wherever he wanted in the world, did whatever he wanted, and didn't have to go through the normal layers of bureaucracy. And he wanted the same thing. And there were points at which, according to a number of stories out of the National Security Council, points at which he demanded the creation of a mercenary force to take on different sorts of functions. So a lot of people, including myself, were worried that in a second term, he would do exactly that. But what Donald Trump, I think, has found is he didn't need to go create a mercenary force. All he needed to do was go take an existing law enforcement agency like ICE and supercharge it. Give it more resources, give it more people.
Militarize it.
And there are far fewer layers of accountability over that law enforcement agency than something like the FBI. And I would know, because I used to oversee it. It's a lot easier for the President of the United States to hijack ICE and turn it into his private police force than it is the FBI, even though he's also trying to do that with the FBI. And now you are seeing that. And now Congress has given ICE a budget to make it the largest law enforcement agency in America. And what people don't realize is ICE is not just about immigration enforcement. They can enforce a vast array of crimes. They do internet cases, child exploitation cases, counterproliferation, counterterrorism. They have a huge investigative remit. So you will see American citizens being investigated, pursued, arrested by ICE with greater regularity in the coming years as ICE starts to take over for things that the FBI was previously doing.
And in terms of accountability, right, there's a sense that journalists, people like yourself who are critical of the regime, are firmly in the crosshairs. I mean, you're essentially more or less an enemy of the state right now. I mean, they put a executive order out against you, didn't they? Yeah, they did. I mean, look, the president equates dissent with treason. And I mean that literally. My crime was criticizing Donald Trump. Granted, I did it relentlessly and for years. And for that, he accused me of the highest crime in the U.S. Constitution, the crime of treason, a crime punishable by death. And he is having me investigated for treason because I argued he shouldn't be reelected, because I told the American people about how bad it was inside the Trump administration. But what's happening to me is just a microcosm of what's happening to the country. Is Donald Trump wants to, and it already is pursuing, a vast array of investigations into other critics like me as a way to deter potential disloyalty within his ranks, to discourage people in the public from criticizing him, but also to create a model for scaling that up against entire industries and sectors. You have seen him doing versions of what he's doing to me, to the legal sector, the educational sector, the business sector of the American economy. This is more than just what you would call a whole of government strategy, where he's bringing every department and agency into the effort. It's a whole of society strategy where he's attempting to exert control over the major institutions in society, first through fear, and then if he needs to, through force. And to the point about it being a whole of government strategy, I mean, look, it was just reported the other week that the president has an interagency task force, a group of government officials from all the major national security departments and agencies focused on his revenge campaign. So there are people meeting every single week from the CIA, from the FBI, from the Department of Homeland Security, sitting in a room and talking about the president's personal foes and how they can use the powers of government to go after those people. This is the type of stuff any of us would have thought was a fiction book. This could never happen in the United States of America. An American president is not going to take the law enforcement and spy community and put them in a room and make them go after his critics. Is he? But he is. And how does that make you feel? Because like it's kind of like mind-boggling to me to be sat in front of someone that genuinely is, you're gambling with your life to a certain degree, right? Like you wrote in your book predicting the authoritarian turns that this government can make. You said today that 80% of the predictions that you made in your book have already come to fruition quicker than you expected to.
Yeah.
The natural kind of the direction of this conversation is making me think, well, Or you, Miles, you could be locked up in an American jail before the end of this administration. That seems to me an entirely plausible outcome. I mean, how do you square with that psychologically?
I mean, I could be arrested on my return
Fly back from Canada, yeah.
It's completely possible. We don't know when the shoe will drop.
Do you want to be arrested?
No, who wants to? I have like a small family. I have a little girl at home. Like, I want my country to go back to normal, which is why I'm doing this. What I decided to do after I got targeted by the president's investigative order to his agencies, go investigate Miles Taylor, prove to me that he's guilty of the thing I just charged him with being guilty of, treason, which, by the way, is the inverse of the justice system. The justice system usually starts with evidence of a crime that gets investigated, then someone's charged. Not the president saying, that guy's guilty of treason and go find me the proof. Be that as it may. I faced a choice that everyone else in our country is going to have to face. Once I was targeted, I could retreat and hope it blew over, or capitulate, or the second option was fight back. And I'll be honest with you, most people in my life, most people in any target's life, when someone like a president is going after them, advised me, just lay low. Just hope he's doing this to be mean. Just hope he's doing this to embarrass you. Lay low, protect your family, let it blow over, let someone else fight the fight. But if everyone does that, it just becomes the norm. If you don't make it hard for them to punish citizens unlawfully, then it becomes a standard that any president of any political party can do. Donald Trump has proven two things this year about the rule of law in the United States that didn't exist before 2025. He's proven that, one, the president of the United States can now, with the stroke of a pen, order anyone to be investigated. And two, with a social media post, he can pressure his prosecutors to get that person indicted. It's never been so easy in American history to extrajudicially punish someone as it is today. Now, I think eventually the courts, over several years and cases and innocent people being thrown in jail, will ultimately find that those two things are unconstitutional. No, a president cannot just launch investigations with the stroke of a pen, and he cannot just create indictments into people by ordering his folks to do that. But it's going to take years for the justice system to catch up to the reality, and a lot of damage can be done in that time period. So that decision I made is one I felt like was a very important example-setting moment. And I'm not going to lie, it's not like I came to that immediately. My first instinct was,
lay fucking low, man.
Protect my family.
Yeah.
I got a young baby. I got a wife I care about. I felt like I'd done enough. Yeah. Felt like I'd been out there enough. But it was my wife, spine of steel, who came to me and said, this isn't right. None of this is right. And we can't let this happen to the next person and the next person and the next person. And if it does, we're going to feel like we were guilty and complicit in that if we didn't do more. And so basically from that day, I have committed that I will be out there every single day, not Monday through Friday, every single day until this administration's over and this president is gone, trying to shine a light on abuses of power, unlawful abuses of power, until we can reconcile them.
Trump has got people looking and trawling at like mortgages and, your whole entire record of how you've conducted your life financially to see if there is a crime in there. Yeah. And if there is a crime, then that can be leveraged to quell that person's dissent, right? This is happening right before our eyes. And I wonder what you think, as someone who's also an expert on tech, which is kind of why we're at this conference. We're not just here to talk about the insanity of...
And I would love to be in a world where I could just focus on tech.
I know. But the tech guys are in his pocket, right? Like he now has access to the data that they are able to gather, and he can use that to be able to, trawl through all of your stuff to find perhaps something where you filed something incorrectly in your taxes, etc., and use that to shut you down. I mean, the convergence between the data that's being collected by these companies and the kind of bastardized attitudes to the Constitution and power that Trump is exercising are coming together and converging. So, this is really concerning, no?
The term techno-authoritarian is something that I didn't really like that term when it first made its way onto the scene. Because to me, authoritarian was just authoritarian. And it was obvious what those places were. Russia and China, and they were very clearly manipulating artificial intelligence to further oppress populations that were already oppressed. But I've come to like the term more because I think it is accurately describing in the United States how authoritarianism can come in the back door, or more specifically, the digital back end. And we're seeing that happen in the United States. You saw that with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. DOJ demanded in the earliest days of the second Trump administration a direct data feed from every federal agency. They wanted all of them plugged into a massive cloud-based AI system that they had built bespoke, that didn't necessarily have the normal federal security protections in place, that clearly wasn't compliant with U.S. privacy laws, and which we still know very, very little about. We don't know if there is someone who still has the ability, God mode, to query the entirety of the U.S. government's data holdings with one person's name, with a search for a list of people. Can you find crimes related to them? We don't know. We don't know what they did with that data. The administration hasn't told us. Congress hasn't demanded oversight because it's in the hands of the president's party. And people who've worked on DOJ, the very few of them, have said nothing publicly about what they did with that data. All we know is they were largely successful. They got most of those agencies, including the U.S. Department of Treasury, that accounts for every penny that comes into and out of the federal government, to connect those data feeds in. They've taken over the Internal Revenue Service, everyone's taxes. They sought data feeds from certain law enforcement departments and agencies, Social Security Administration. They tried to do the same thing. What's happened with that? What are they doing with that data? We don't know. But that's the type of thing that could easily lead a democratic country into a techno-authoritarian one. Even if the president of the United States has the ability to just search the name of one person in that database and say, "Dear God, government AI, what is Miles Taylor guilty of?" That's unconstitutional. That's authoritarian. And right now, at this moment, Donald Trump may very well possess that ability.
And these not just the data companies, but let's say the social media giants, your Jeff Bezos's, all of these techno-feudal overlords have all got a piece of the pie that is very much their castle and their fiefdom, right? Yeah. And those people have no interest in being accountable anyway, because what's most important for them is clearly maximizing their net worth. Yeah. And they've got a president who acts and behaves in exactly the same way. So we have no real hope, do we, of these guys being held accountable internally, unless there's a Miles Taylor in every single one of these companies who's willing to come out and say, hey, do you know what? This is what's actually going on, and this isn't right. Yeah. Do you think that there are people just like you in those companies who are considering making that jump, but are worried by seeing what's happening to you right now?
Well, I'll tell you that the administration wants them to be worried. I mean, we have witnessed in just the past 9 months the most concerted effort to crack down on whistleblowers ever in American history, including first inside the United States government, all the normal pathways someone has to blow the whistle on corruption. They basically closed off those pathways, either by planting one of the president's loyalists in one of the jobs where people go report those complaints to. Okay, you're not going to go report a workplace complaint, to the Stasi in Nazi Germany, right? You're not going to go do that. So they put people in those jobs, so you can't blow the whistle inside of government without fear of retaliation. They've made it harder to go to Congress, but in the private sector, they've made it harder by intimidating the law firms that would normally represent whistleblowers by saying, look, if you represent someone that doesn't support this administration's policies, we're going to crack down on you. We're going to punish you. And that message has been felt beyond the law firms. It's been felt in all of these places. So whistleblowers have far fewer protections than we would otherwise hope. And we are dependent on them now to tell us what's going on in some of these places. Now, as far as these tech companies, I mean, look, what's really sad to see is how quickly these self-described, courageous, brave tech leaders have suddenly lost their courage and seen it replaced by their self-interest. And I say that as someone who's very techie and very pro-tech.
Yeah.
But I've watched people like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook go from being vehemently opposed to government repression, abuses of power. Donald Trump himself, he spent hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure Donald Trump didn't win re-election, to becoming champions of the Trump administration, frequent attendees at dinner, big donors to Trump projects. Am I supposed to believe that suddenly these people found Jesus and it's Donald Trump? Or the likelier explanation, it's just a lot more convenient now if they suck up to the guy.
Isn't it just megalomania? Like, I just assume that these people have just got completely unfettered power. As a result of that, they've just become normalized to them. They can do as they please. And so all they're going to do is crowd in behind the person who kind of enables them to kind of keep on doing whatever the hell they want, right? Like, how do we get to a place where regulation is now seen as a virtue? You know, rather our society seems to be holding up on a pedestal this idea of might is right, do whatever you will, and that is exactly how you should try and live.
I mean, I said a few weeks ago that I felt like the rule of law is dead in the United States.
Right.
And I stand by that. It sounds like a very hyperbolic statement. But if the rules are not applied equally, and it's very obvious right now they're not, then you can't possibly say the rule of law is alive. Because the whole purpose of the rule of law is that it's applied equal. There's equal protection. But right now, there's very evidently one track for people who are allies of the president. He tells the Department of Justice, close cases into them, close investigations, and give them favorable regulatory treatment. And another path for critics. Investigate them, throw them in prison, don't let their companies win. And you see that in big decisions like the merger of companies.
That's what it was like open corruption. It's literally just out there, right? Like you could
completely out there.
It's gonna be out there. We're gonna get TikTok. We're gonna give it to Larry Ellison. Was it Barron Trump? You can go in and work on it.
Larry Ellison is about to become the most powerful oligarch in America.
In history, probably, right? Like
in the United States in history, quite possibly. And that's not by chance. It's not by hard work. It's by sucking up to the president of the United States. And I'm not saying Ellison didn't do great things in his career. He built great businesses. But now he's multiplying by orders of magnitude his influence by sucking up to the Trump administration, by winning personal favor with the president, and getting favorable regulatory treatment. It looks like they'll be the likeliest ones to buy Warner Brothers Discovery, not because they're necessarily the best, but because the administration is literally signaling that they're going to make it too hard for anyone else to win. They are doling out favors in the open, and the president has wrapped himself in presidential immunity and said, look, anything that I do in my official functions, I can't be held liable for. So right now, it is a corruption free-for-all in the United States. The rule of law for the moment is moribund, all right? The grave has been dug. It's laying down there. The dirt hasn't been put on top of it yet. The question is, like Lazarus, can it rise again? Or is that it? And I don't think we know the answer to the question yet.
And I think the thing that could be, I was going to say the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it's not going to be a straw. It's going to be seismic, is if this AI bubble bursts, right? Like this is an incredible graphic that shows all of the convergence of investment between all of the top AI companies, Microsoft and OpenAI invested in NVIDIA, all of these hundreds of billions of dollars just being pumped into each other.
Yeah.
And a stock market that keeps on growing despite Liberation Day tariffs, despite global uncertainty on trade. You know, if that stock market pops and the retail American investor who probably still feels, okay, I'm a bit pro-Trump, I might not like his style, but my pension's looking good and my funds are looking positive. They're gonna be scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they're going to be insecure as the rest of America.
Well, look, just like the housing crisis in 2008, it's the critical dependencies, the secondary and tertiary consequences that you cannot see that kill you. And what you just said, we don't even fully know how mapped out the investment, cross-investment, and critical dependencies are with the AI bubble. All we can reasonably suspect is it's so vast and complex that if it gets popped, we cannot possibly even predict the secondary and tertiary consequences of that happening. And it's likely to be very severe, and not just for, oligarchs, but for your average American. The one thing that gives me sort of cynically a little bit of optimism is that when so many people get kicked down on their knees, mass mobilization is possible and increases. And one of the few things we know about backsliding from democracy is it typically requires mass mobilization. The courts aren't going to save you. Elected leaders in Congress aren't going to save you. The people are going to have to save themselves. And that requires a lot of them. And it requires a lot of them being really pissed off. And I think that's what's going to happen if we want to prevent Donald Trump from continuing to flagrantly break the law, but also from attempting to continue in office beyond his term, which his allies have expressed a desire to do, and which he himself has expressed a tongue-in-cheek desire to do.
Some listeners will be listening to this conversation thinking, this is just doomsday hysteria, right?
Yeah, sure. I don't blame them.
We've been hearing this thing's going to end. We were told that the tariffs were going to lead to capitulation. Everything's still growing. Why should we believe this now? I mean, the midterms are coming up. There's a chance that Trump could try and gerrymander some of the elections.
Yeah.
In my mind, that could be the most foolish thing he could do, because if that gets exposed, that is just going to compound that popular anger and popular immiseration against the regime.
Here's where I disagree with you. He's already convinced half of the population on his political side that it's a legitimate thing to do. Now, when the president attempted to stay in power in 2020, the mistake he made is he hadn't prepared his party for the fact that he was going to do it. So just enough Republicans, not even the majority of them, but just enough Republicans said, wait a second, this is wrong. Stop. We might impeach you. And it was just enough to stop him, convince him he didn't have support, and he had to leave. This time around, he's done something very, very different. He's prepared the whole party. And in fact, he's gotten them excited about the idea of gerrymandering congressional districts, about rigging the election. They're fully behind him. I don't think you're going to see, you will see from the left, but if Donald Trump rigs the 2026 elections and later the 2028 election, when he will try to be back on the ballot, I think you're going to see one political party in this country stand solidly behind him, which is what's really, really scary. And so I'm not even sure that it's that democratic manipulation in the process that will scare people. And in fact, they're planning to do it very openly. The congressional gerrymandering has happened in the plain light of day. They're quite literally trying to rig the election by making sure it's more likely that Republicans will win more seats. But also, Donald Trump has taken election deniers and people who conspired to overthrow the 2020 election, and he has put them in the jobs to oversee election security in the federal government. That would be like putting the bank robbers in charge of the vault at the bank. That's what he's doing. But he's putting them in charge of protecting the ballots. You can't see that and think anything other than they are preparing to do exactly that in 2026 and 2028, which to me sounds crazy. It's crazy to say out loud that the leader of the free world is planning to rig elections. That's something that we used to say about banana republics and foreign despotisms far away. I can say with confidence, as someone who used to run the department in the Trump administration that oversees election security, that's what it appears they are doing right now.
So you think Trump 2028, it's not a joke? It's for real?
I do not think the election in the midterms or the election in 2028 will be a free and fair election in the United States.
Wow. I mean, that's just a lot for people to chomp down on. I mean, it feels as if what you're saying is the only way for there to be a chart to hope for some semblance of return to normalcy. I was going to say, it's whatever future we go into, it's going to be fundamentally new and fundamentally different. But it feels like the only thing that can precipitate that is an economic downturn, right? Is a sense of economic crisis, pushing people to look inwardly at the system itself being corrupt and thinking about how you
That's probably the fastest way. It's probably the fastest way. But if the economy if there's no downturn, look, like all autocrats, Trump will eventually do something so self-defeating that the population turns against him. Eventually, all centrally planned systems and economies fall in on themselves because people don't like the power being consolidated. They ultimately don't like being told what to do. They'll tolerate it for a while, sometimes a very long while, but eventually those systems end up collapsing. In the immediate term, look, American people don't like troops on their city streets. That's weird for them. That feels scary to them. And Trump loves it because to him, it's the clearest manifestation of his power, that he can send troops in somewhere and take over. So absent what happens with the economy, I can see Trump's military deployments increasing the level of mass mobilization against him and popular opposition. But that's going to take a lot longer than if Americans realize, wait a second, all of these stupid economic decisions have hurt me very personally, very significantly, and perhaps irrevocably.
You're a Republican, ideologically or historically. So I imagine you really do believe in markets and in freedom in the kind of traditional sense. Do you not think that Trump himself is a consequence of a failure of capitalism?
I think Donald Trump is a symptom of techno-populism. I think it's actually technology more than anything, more than capitalism, more than, the way elite institutions were constructed. He is what happens, the dark side of the hyper empowerment of the individual, right? The internet, of course, we saw with the Arab Spring and, any number of other things since the age of social media has allowed individuals to have a much louder voice. And generally, that's a really great thing. All of us want sovereignty and control over our own lives and to be able to go out there in the world and say what we want, to be hyper empowered. But that hyper empowerment has meant that individuals increasingly, especially those that are digital natives, they don't trust institutions anymore. They don't trust the legacy media because they can be just as powerful with CNN as CNN with their cell phone. They don't trust government because they can make the decision about what they want on a piece of legislation. And they don't like what their representative says. And increasingly, they felt like their voice is the government, is the media. That leads to the same type of populism we saw 2,000 years ago in antiquity, when early experiments in democracy failed under the weight of populism, as the people banded together in mob-like fashion to ultimately deprive themselves of their own rights. And that's what we know happens with populism. It tends to authoritarianism. Why? Because people are willing, in a populist setting, to give up their rights because they don't see the immediate benefit from the rule of law to go get the benefit. Oh, you're going to give me housing, you're going to give me money, you're going to give me things that I want. Fine, I'll give you my rights, go give it to me. And then a tyrant takes over. We're seeing that now. The techno-populism has resulted in people loving what Donald Trump has to say, relishing the fact that he wants to destroy legacy systems, and excited about all the promises he's offered them. Promises, by the way, that he has to break the rule of law to deliver on, but they'll give that to him, just like they did 2,000 years ago. But there's also a playbook for that, and a playbook for responding to it. We know from antiquity that the way you respond to that sort of corrosive populism is with a different type of populism. Is you make values popular again, values like the rule of law. You mobilize people into a populist pro-democracy opposition. And that is what I think we are starting to see emerge in the United States. And I wouldn't say I'm hopeful about it, but I would say it's our best hope to counter this.
So I've been thinking about this as well. I think, my podcast is called What's Left because we've been trying to figure out what is the project of the progressive left in the face of rising ethno-nationalist, nativist populism.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that this kind of centrist principle that anything populist is wrong, is bad, is ultimately causing it to fail, because what they can't do is harness that energy, that popular anger, that immiseration that people are feeling of a system that does not provide for them anymore. And it sounds like what you're saying there is that the populism that we need to be a corrective to the type of authoritarian like Trump is one that is ultimately more just and redistributive and supports the average person on the street in a way that the system hasn't done for the last 45, 50 years, right? In terms of taking all that GDP growth and going it straight to the top 1%. It sounds like you're a bit of an economic populist.
I'm actually not. I'm the opposite. I'm a total libertarian conservative. I'm a free market, small government, get the government the hell out of my life. But here's what unites me with economic populists is I think in a future in which you have ubiquitous artificial intelligence across the American economy performing functions that people used to perform, you almost have no option but to replace the existing welfare state with something like universal basic income.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see small government libertarians and big government liberals united because of these scary changes in technology, where they're going to come together and say, oh, wait, we have an opportunity here to do something very interesting. You know, libertarians like me want to see the existing welfare state detonated. We think it's bloated. We think it's inefficient. We don't think it serves its purpose. But we also want to see a more compassionate system in place. And something like UBI offers that possibility. And there's a lot of people on the left who are like, that would be a better, more sustainable lifestyle for people who are, in the existing welfare system. And so, the Trump of it all aside, I do think technology is pushing us to a place where actually those polar opposites on the political spectrum will be close to each other in a circle instead of on that spectrum.
But the UBI stuff, it always makes me concerned as like a labor and pro-work guy, thinking that actually we're stopping people from having jobs. Ultimately, we're stopping from people from having that ownership and that pride of work.
Yeah.
And if we've seen anything in those deindustrialized communities that have become pro-Trump, is that loss of status that they had associated with work is part of what they're so angry about. And in a world of universalized basic income.
Well, but that's why it's the operative word there is basic.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
Is like, think about any subscription you've got anywhere. Who's still on the basic version of Spotify? You're on the ad-based version if you make the choice to be on the ad-based version.
Premium income.
That's right.
Okay.
And so there's still the inherent incentive to aspire to the next thing, to the bigger thing. But there's a safety net, a guaranteed clear safety net that gives you autonomy, the autonomy you want without the government making the decision about what you should buy at the grocery store, as part of your benefits and, how you should spend it. Is here's your safety net. It's reliable and it gives you the freedom you want. I don't know. I think that stands a chance in the coming years of providing an answer to the question, how do we unite those disparate parts of the political spectrum around the welfare programs of the future?
It's a fascinating world that we're imagining right now, but it's one that actually is really not that far away, is it? With the advent of robotics, AI, etc.
I think it's imminent.
You think it's imminent?
I think it's imminent.
Do you think we get to that world before we go to a war?
My biggest worry about war and technology is certainly anything happening in the Pacific, with China and what might happen, but people have long fantasized about the dystopia of, the robots rising up against the people. I don't worry about a robot war. I worry about a people versus people war in which one side likes the robots and the other doesn't. To me, that's the likeliest scenario for civil strife that looks like the Terminator, that is predictable, which is that we are, I think, very likely to see a cultural movement that I would call the unpluggers, who, rightly or wrongly, get really freaked out about what's happening in artificial intelligence, especially as we hit some of these major milestones, as quantum computing gets error corrected and perfected and used to supercharge artificial intelligence, people will get very scared. And you will see a popular movement of unpluggers that want to go destroy base stations and server farms and sever transatlantic cables. And you will see people who don't want it to happen. And the ones who don't want it to happen will want to deploy robotic forces against the ones that do. This is a story that could play out domestically in a lot of countries. And it's something that I've had a lot of conversations with national security figures internationally about, is thinking through how to play out some of the cultural change that's going to be coming from the unpluggers versus the stay connected communities. And again, regardless of where you stand in that sort of debate, we are seeing the early aspects of social organization and cultural organization around those phenomena. And I think as humanoid robots start to be deployed and like visibly taking people's jobs, it will take that from a fringe worry into a mainstream worry about people doing that. And that's going to lead to probably a great deal of repression in places around the globe.
And that's, I guess, what Peter Thiel was talking about when he's saying the Luddite is the Antichrist, right? He's talking about this.
I guess so. I think that the whole purpose of Peter Thiel's lectures is to convince people with a wink and a nod that he is the Antichrist.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's cool enough to win that mantle. So.
He just comes across like a prick.
That's right. That's right.
Miles, legend.
Thanks my
so
friend.
much.
Appreciate you.
What a mad interview. Here's your reminder to delete your JD Vance memes, scrub your watch history of this podcast if you're planning on going to the States anytime soon. I'm going to be reassessing my options. And Miles, Godspeed, brother. Thank you for such a brilliant chat. Our next interview is with Sasha Havlicek, who runs the ISD, a leading think tank on extremism, radicalisation, and how maligned actors use digital hate to sow division in our society. She is at the frontier of protecting democracy, having testified before Congress, Parliament in the UK, and advised governments of all different stripes across the world. Sasha Havlicek, welcome to What's Left. ISD are incredible. I love ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Listeners might not be aware of what the work you do is, but essentially you are the kind of research node trying to figure out all of the scary, dangerous things that are happening out there. You know, you guys define the manosphere for people, you define what a groyper is. You know, you're there to help explain to those of us who are interested in figuring out what's happened to the world and what's happening to people online in particular. The thing I wanted to really drill in with you today was about this sense that the world is becoming so extreme. Everyone feels as if they are a victim of something, there is an enemy. There are all of these hallmarks, I would argue, of radicalization that are happening to people online. But people are also really worried about polarization, aren't they? They know that they're being exploited to a certain degree. Who is to blame for this? Mark Zuckerberg?
Oh, you know what? I'm going to quote Mark Zuckerberg now that you've raised him, because I found something earlier that made me laugh, and I rarely quote him and agree with him. But here's what he said a little while ago.
God, we're going to agree with the Zuck.
Now we're going to.
Time today.
Yes, we are. Look, it's really interesting. In 2020, he said, "We don't want private companies making so many decisions about how to balance social equities without any more democratic process." He says, "I actually think on a lot of these questions, it is not just about coming up with the right answer. It's about coming up with the answer that society thinks is legitimate."
Mark Zuckerberg said that?
Yes.
Are we sure?
Yes. Well, apparently, or maybe.
He's got a great PR team, hasn't he?
and how things have changed. I mean, of course, in that, it was, I think, somewhat disingenuous at that time when he said it, because, of course, we weren't seeing them comply with any of the efforts that were already being made and we were making and many of our partners were making to try and get the social media dynamics under control. And we are allowing ourselves to be reduced to caricatures in the online space. And we're allowing, you know, whatever it is, the 10% of the loudest, most annoying people to suck up all the oxygen, and the 80% of the rest of whatever side of an argument to get much less traction. So we're sort of seeing the silencing of anything reasonable or anything kind or anything that might feel humane in the interest of all the most sort of, it just rage bait is really where we are. And in the real world, when you talk to somebody, even when you have diametrically opposed ideas about something, which, by the way, it's not a terrible thing. That's the best way to operate, is having this conversation. It's amazing how courteous and capable people are of having constructive conversations. Yeah. And then somehow this environment and the fact that ultimately they're optimizing engagement for profit over all and any other consideration, safety, kids' safety, security, I mean, just well-being, is a massive part. I would put the blame there, ultimately. I would put the blame on all of us for not catching it earlier and pushing for systemic changes earlier.
So there's a sense that we have some responsibility to decide about how we're going to engage within this space. But really, because we are addicted, because we've signed off on our agency, it feels as if we're not going to be the ones to change this dynamic, right? Either government's going to intervene or the platforms themselves are going to have some Damascene conversion when they realize actually we've broken the world around us. both of those things at the moment seem unlikely, but the government side seems like the one lever that we should be trying to pull.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think in democratic environments, that's the way it should work. We should put pressure on our governments to deal with problems, come up with an array of solutions from which we choose the best possible one, and then iterate if it's not ideal. Nothing is ideal, by the way, in the universe. But there are, I think, some basic principles that we'd want to put in place here. One is, I always think in an authoritarian environment, in an authoritarian country, the response to these kinds of problems online becomes censorship and control. And in a democracy, we've got to do exactly the opposite of that, which is shine the spotlight of transparency, open up the black box so that people can understand how it works and how it's exploiting them. We're in a position now to say, how do we make sure that we've got enough scrutiny, which means access to the data to be able to evaluate not just bits of speech that might be problematic. That's not the point of this. The point is to get at how the algorithmic systems might be pushing us in one direction or another. And by the way, this isn't a left-right thing. Whether it's like nasty foreign state actors or the algorithms themselves, you see amplification happening across the ideological spectrum, but it's distortive, and we want to know when we're being manipulated.
Yeah, and to add to that, let's add a layer of control to normal people's lives as well. Transparency is one aspect of it, of course, because...
Right. And then it's personal control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to throw this to you, digital sovereignty, this notion that normal people should own their own data.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is one of the big ideas that has come out of this conference for me that I fucking love it, right? It's this idea that if you had people realized to what extent that they're being gamed by OpenAI, by Facebook, Instagram, by, all these other things that they use, Google, etc., the fact that these people basically are able to clone you, through your data. They know everything. They know what porn you're watching, and
the value of your data.
Exactly.
And if you knew your,
how much money that
value
you
of your data,
them is insane. Yeah. So imagine a world in which we imagine a world in which we owned our own data, in which we were getting paid for our own data if you were to consent to it being used in that way. That could be the biggest form of redistribution of capital ever seen without one tax rise.
And it raises a really interesting question around consent.
Right, sure.
Because
hidden cookies, it's not consent, is it?
I think that there's a lot of false confidence in younger people as well about what they know and what they understand about how their data is being used, how they're being manipulated. And it's really interesting in polls, like nobody thinks that they're being manipulated because everybody thinks they're too smart for that. You don't want to think, oh, am I that idiot? No, that guy is that idiot, not me. But it's amazing. They know in every category of people, people are being manipulated.
Manipulation for the
younger and older, male and female, whatever. On every demographic front, you have this problem, and yet nobody believes it's them.
Yeah, but it sounds like what you're talking there is a crisis of liberty, a crisis of freedom. This idea that we don't, I'm not like a hard determinist person who believes that like we have no agency at all. I think we in reflecting on our own actions, the options that become open to us change, right?
Absolutely.
But there is a sense that right now I go from spending all my time dopamine maxing on one platform to then video gaming on another, and then I'm going to deliver some food, and then at the end of the day, my cameraman's laughing because he knows what I'm talking about here. You're lying in a pool of your own dopamine, and you feel shit, right?
Yeah.
And like,
it's not a great feeling.
It's really odd, though, isn't it, that we kind of all know that this is going on, and yet think that there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, I think it feels quite overwhelming. It's like, for so many different categories of people, it feels overwhelming. I think for politicians and for governments, there's been a lack of technical understanding of what all of this is and how do you get your head around doing something about this if you don't have the technological expertise to do it. And I actually think that platforms have done a great job in convincing us that we can't do anything about it because we're idiots and we don't know how to do it. You've seen a generation of young people now go through, you know, this first decade of this business model really taking hold. And it hasn't taken long for the users to start thinking, this doesn't feel so great. I don't feel so clean. This doesn't feel quite right to me. To a generation of parents, the first generation of parents dealing with kids raised on this stuff, realizing,
That's my brother, yeah.
I mean, oh my God, understanding now the extent of the harm. I mean, the hellish situation of parents who've lost their children to it. You know, who've taken their road.
Today,
I can't even go there. I mean,
to agentic AI.
it's so unspeakable.
In February, Megan Garcia's 14-year-old son, that's Sewell Setzer III on your screen, died by suicide. She says that Sewell was in a months-long virtual emotional and sexual relationship with a chatbot known as Danny. Garcia claims the character AI chatbot encouraged Sewell to take his own life.
It's unconscionable, unspeakable, disgusting things that have happened because of children being led, you know, to
being seduced by an AI.
Seduced entirely, absolutely horrific stories. So I think we are at a turning point where we start to see more and more sectors understanding it. So, you know, whether you're interested in, I don't know, the future of, you know, the climate or public health or migration, all the big, you know, challenges of our time, or if you know, or even, you know, national security. I did a lot of work, national security, public safety, kids' safety, all of those issues. You're not going to be able to make progress on any of them unless you solve this information crisis.
Yeah.
And that is understanding that we are in an era, these are the tools of mass manipulation.
But I think what just occurred to me in this conversation is the genius of these companies in framing the issue as a matter of like freedom, right? So like if the government comes and intervenes, what they're trying to do is take away your ability to, you know, exercise power over your life. But no one knows about what control over data that they have and how they're being able to manipulate you as a result of it. It's like it's the perfect ploy to be able to keep on pulling the strings from above.
It's been very smart actually for them to be presenting what they're doing as a sort of defense of speech, defense of freedoms, when in fact these platforms are not free speech environments. They're curated speech environments where they decide what you do and don't see based on ultimately that calculation around the bottom line. So it's really important that we do in fact create free speech environments where we do create a marketplace, a free marketplace of ideas and competition of ideas. That is what we need. Yeah. But that's not what we have now. No. So that is where we need to absolutely, that's the regulation, if we have any, the policies that we put in place have to make that possible. Free speech, a proper free speech environment.
And there's really no one better to talk to about how we navigate these pitfalls on free speech than our next guest, Imran Ahmed. Imran is the head of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, a non-profit dedicated to exposing the true impacts of big tech. He often appears as a talking head on mainstream media, explaining how digital platforms can moonlight as conduits for real-life harms, claiming they often dodge responsibility through their lack of transparency. But he's also dipped his toes into alt media, including an infamous exchange with right-wing influencer Konstantin Kisin, which we do get into. Imran Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us. Head boss man at the CCDH, Center for Countering Digital Hate. Yeah. I want to tell you a little bit about something we did recently, which is kind of the most controversial interview we've done. We did an interview with George Aberonier, who is the president-elect of the Oxford Union, who was accused of celebrating Charlie Kirk's death. Now, I don't know if this story came across we got picked up by the Washington Post, GB News, Spectator, and all the rest. And what George said, whilst many would describe it as borderline hate speech, being perceived to celebrate death, he said, Charlie Kirk got shot, lol, publicly. He said privately, Charlie Kirk got shot, let's fucking go. The Oxford Union members have moved to remove him now from that post, which is a very interesting position because as an institution that upheld absolutist free speech, ultimately what those members said there was whilst that speech was not unlawful, it was not befitting of somebody in charge of an institution of that kind. Do you think that there's now been an acceptance then, even on the right, that there should be some limits here to free speech?
I think there always have been. I mean, look, Was it Cambridge Union?
It was Oxford Union.
Oxford Union. So, like, to me, the very concept of absolutist free speech, which is for everyone, for terrorists, for pedophiles, for anyone else, like for a platform that sends thousands of content to a young child telling them their body's not good enough and they should go on a starvation diet. Like, no one agrees with that beyond first-year PPE or SPS students at Cambridge. Like, sitting there going, like, well, should we absolutely believe in absolute free speech? So once you get past being a child and you start thinking about as an adult, you start thinking, well, actually, there are norms, aren't there? If you go into a pub, you start screaming about the black people, you'll be chucked out. You go to work and you start talking about Jews in a funny way, I will sack you. So I think that once you get past that, what he said was disgusting, offensive, and if I was his boss, I would have fired him in a New York minute. But sure, theoretically, if you want to have a first year debate about absolute freedom of speech, in a world in which there was such a thing as absolute freedom of speech, which has never existed on this planet and never will, theoretically, it would be permissible.
I know firsthand about the effects that social media has had on my generation, being able to litigate kind of our own social problems, the kind of grey areas of growing up as a teenager, about people's status and hierarchies and all the rest. And it's definitely been more difficult, if I look to my brothers, for instance, who didn't grow up with it, to my generation, about how you manage your anxieties, your personality within that context. But then at the same time, I think that people have a sense that this freedom that they've got with social media to be whoever they want to be and to pursue whatever lifestyle that they want to pursue and graft their image around that, if we start to try and change those things by introducing, set like language that can't be acceptable, that language that we think is actually beyond the pale, people think that that's a clamp down on their freedom to be who they are.
But I don't think the law should do that. So let me be absolutely straight. I'm still a liberal. Like, I profoundly believe the government should not be telling us what we can and cannot say. But I'm just saying that people will tell you what you can and cannot say all the time. And that there is a vigorous debate on what's acceptable in society, what is tolerable in society all the time. And that's normal. I do think that it's a broader discussion. And I think one of the pathologies of modernity is that we make it all about speech. And it's not about speech. It's also about the structures of society that create opportunity for all.
And dignity.
And respect. And part of the irony is, of course, that the whole debate over free speech is sponsored in part by platforms that want to have no accountability for the part they play in speech, right? And I don't think this is a naturally occurring debate. Real people understand that tech is like basically manipulating them. They don't like it. They know that it's causing harm to kids. They really don't like that. And they know that it's polarizing our societies. And they're really worried about that. And they're like, well, what can we do about it? And politicians keep going, well, we're still having a first year SPS debate or PPE debate on whether or not freedom of speech is absolute or not. And it's like, can we just get on with having some basic transparency, accountability, and responsibility for platforms that if they distort our world, and they are, for better or for worse, the primary locus of so much of the transactions and the interactions that we have as human beings. Yeah. Unless we have some accountability there, I think that we're actually going to, and in part what they do is they get us distracted with the debates about freedom of speech, when actually it's about why they are the only people that are beyond accountability or transparency in our society.
I want to bring up a difficult conversation that you had, which was on Triggernometry podcast.
Should you be able to call for an armed revolution on social media?
Well, do you think they should?
Well, wouldn't that cause harm?
On the one hand, Konstantin Kistin wants to have that thing of, well, who's the arbiter ultimately of the edges of free speech?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you want to say that thing about we need to have dignity in these conversations and we need to have a respect for other people's where they're coming from.
I found that a very frustrating conversation, especially now in retrospect, given that he claims to be the arbiter of who's English and who's not. Which he seems to define as the colour of your skin makes you either English or British. He was the one who said that Rishi Sunak...
Ethnically, basically the argument they're making that what matters is ethnicity, right? Like Englishness is just an ethnicity.
Colour. Yeah. I mean, so like...
it's race.
This is a guy who... who really, who considers himself the arbiter of people's identity, and at the same time he's like, well, who is there to tell you what's true or not?
I'm not English. I will never be English. I don't think Rishi Sunak is English. We're both British, but we're not English.
No, you weren't born here. You were an immigrant.
No, well, my son was born here. I don't think my son is English.
The problem isn't that we don't have mechanisms for deciding what's true or not. We have lots of mechanisms. Think about it in science, for example. We have the scientific method. We have a system of journals, of academia, which has actually brought us to a position where we have technologies that are able to transmit information around the world to billions of people at light speed for zero cost. And this idea that there can be no arbiter of truth, I think, is such a profoundly childish and nihilistic view on the world, when in fact, it's through conversations like this that we come to truth. I was hoping to walk into that, having a conversation with someone with a different political philosophy to me, which I do all the time and enjoy doing. Unfortunately, he was, I think, trying to find difference with me, which is sad, because actually, if we'd had more time and if there wasn't maybe a camera on us, I'm sure we would have been able to agree on some things. Although we'd never agreed on the fact that I consider myself to be English because I was born in England. My grandfather came to England in 1947. I support the English football team. I support the English cricket team. Who the fuck is he to tell me who I am?
There's two kind of views I had. I think on the one hand, on that specific interview, I think what he was trying to do was hold up to his audience the person who thinks they get to decide what free speech is.
Yeah.
I think that's what he wanted you.
But that's not our policy platform. Our policy platform is transparency, accountability, and responsibility, and what's illegal.
Freedom.
Freedom. So what's illegal online, offline should be legal online. It makes sense. Protection of kids, saying that we shouldn't have a distortive lens on the information ecosystem, or if you do, you should have transparency about it. Tell us how you're distorting it. And it's like, we want more informed speech. I think there are extremist movements that rely on the distortions on social media. So I think of it this way. If every day you see a story about how Muslims are pedos on Facebook, you see it every single day. At the end of the year, someone comes along and goes, that Prime Minister, they're hiding the fact that there's an epidemic of Muslim pedos in the UK. I'm the only one who's telling you the truth about it. And so therefore we have to go and tear down the government. Now that sounds like an abstract but worrying thing. That's literally what happened to Theresa May. It happened 10 years ago, to Theresa May, when Tommy Robinson was saying that she was in hoc to the Islamist pedos. And so, we have this problem that I think that the people who take advantage of disinformed people, who show some leg to anti-vaxxers, to people that believe in the Great Replacement theory, and you can all, I don't want to name them, but we all know which political movements I'm talking about, and they're either inching close to power or they're in power all over the world now because our information ecosystem is bent to support them and their distortive politics, which is based on lies, not the attempt to find common truths and to find solutions to the problems that people really have. So I don't think this is a left or right thing. I think this is a bullshitter extremist versus those of us who just want to get on with the hard work in a democracy of making lives better for normal people.
And I think on that bullshitter side as well, we should never forget that it's in their economic interest. And from that,
eyeballs is dollars, baby, and that's what it is.
But this is the problem with the attention economy, isn't it? I mean, it's in there.
But the attention economy has always existed, but the attention economy is now fundamentally distorted to reward hate and disinformation because they get the highest engagement. And it's, Andrew Tate says a third of your followers need to be haters because they're the ones who give you the engagement, the clicks, the sending it to other people, the replying to you, that puts you up the algorithmic league table that gets you amplified to billions. Yeah, these people are smart.
Yeah, whether you like him or loathe him, you're basically getting him paid.
Absolutely.
And so but I think that's what's really fascinating about how far the Overton window online has shifted, right? Like the idea now, I went to McGill yesterday to a pints and policy night just to see what the students were saying. And this one kid was telling me, he goes, I think I know more about the far right than the analysts who are working for government. And I said, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, my algorithm is constantly peppered by this stuff. Like, do people know what a groper is really in government? I was like, some do, most don't. But that's so revealing, right? It's like, this is an entertainment infrastructure. Nick Fuentes fundamentally is, I know this might sound like upsetting to hear because what he says is so disgusting sometimes, but he's an entertainer first, right? What he's trying to do is he's trying to elucidate an emotive reaction from people who are going, that's completely obscene, but oh, wait, I never thought about connecting those two dots together, right? This guy was he was an absolute nutter, like just a year ago or 2 years ago, and now people are watching him every single day online.
So you know, that to me is the key to it. You know, we've made this about freedom of speech when actually it's about perverse economics. And then the question is, well, look, these companies do create a lot of good. Like you said, it allows spaces for people to express themselves, to connect, at their best, they're meant to be about shrinking the world, making us more familiar with each other, less racist, because we see each other as we are, as human beings. But what's it actually done? It's divided us even within our own communities. And so when you've got perverse economics like that, that's when regulation is normal. Like, we intervene in markets all the time to align the positives with the public good, so profit with public good, and also to create costs for, you know, what economists call negative externalities, which are the harms that come out of something.
Yeah, but sorry, just to jump in there, but profit has become private goods now, right? Like it is in the interest, you know, when people talk about the failure and the collapse of the Soviet Union, someone like John Gray would say he predicted it not because of like fundamentals around what their economies were doing, but because of the hollowness that their society became, because people knew the system was corrupt, and so that corruption trickled down to the bottom of it, right? People just didn't trust each other. Institutions didn't have popular consent. I feel like we're getting to a similar place now in our societies where your grifters are essentially representing this sense of economic, you know, corruption, this idea that just as long as you can make money off of it, you should do it. Andrew Tate's philosophy ultimately is completely about a dog-eat-dog world where you can just make money by exploiting as many people as possible.
Sure.
And I think people feel as if the system itself that is meant to be underpinning, you know, our society and making sure that people ultimately, you know, have popular consent for it, is also failing us in that same regard.
So, you know, John Gray's a great student and of Hobbes, and you know what you were describing there is the state of nature in Leviathan. It's the idea that it's all man in a war against all men, because we don't trust each other. Where trust breaks down, accountability breaks down. Basically, you're at war with your neighbor because you don't know what they're going to do, and there's no way of holding them accountable, and you don't trust them as well. And you know that famously Thomas Hobbes wrote, in that state of nature, men live short, nasty, brutish lives. Right, and I've got a 1-year-old. I've got another kid on the way in March. I don't want them to live that life. I don't want to leave the world worse than I inherited it. I think that's a disgusting thing to do as a human being and as a generation. And I'm Gen X and the last of Gen X, just before millennials, and it just fills me with utter despair. The idea that my kids will live in a world in which they can't tell the difference between truth and lies. Because you're right, and John Gray's right, what he said about the Soviet Union. My colleague Irina grew up in the Soviet Union. She's Jewish, she was exiled to Siberia with her family, and then they moved to Baltimore, of all places, in Maryland, in the United States on the East Coast. And you know, she always explains it that what the Soviets did was that it wasn't just that they lied to you, it's that they gave you a mix of lies and truth, such that you couldn't tell the difference anymore, and you just gave up. And she said, and that is what led to the apathy, and apathy is the truest enemy of democracy. And in a world in which we can no longer discern the truth, in which there are no common truths, apathy reigns, but also fear and mistrust reign. And I think that world is a bad one to live in. And it is absolutely the role of government, which is the collection of our will into action with, of course, all these special, unique gifts that we give it, including a monopoly of the use of violence, the use of force, to create those common standards, to create that unity. And the first thing it needs to do is break apart the engine that is ripping us apart. That's the first thing they need to do. Only then can we start to heal. While we're being actively torn apart, while a distortive lens has been provided to each of us, laser produced, with our own psychology, understanding what it is that makes us most anxious, most desperate to keep scrolling and checking what's happening next. Until we break that apart, we're fucked.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's that thing about economic incentives and the way that our systems now don't enable people to exercise actual choice.
Yeah.
I constantly think, I'm really interested in addiction, because I think what's basically going on right now is that capitalism has got to a point where we just have such unfettered choice. There's so many different options that you think that you have freedom, that you have agency. But really what young people are doing is that they're jumping from one addiction to another. They're jumping from a porn addiction to a scroll addiction to a gambling addiction. And I see it in young men a lot of the time, going to the football. It's gambling plus coke plus whatever. All of these things are swimming in the same ecosystem. Cheap dopamine is being released, but ultimately it's frustrating these people from actually becoming the person that they want to be, because exercising any of those virtues requires, going through a bit of struggle as well. I feel like we have to have a bit of a moral rewiring about what our sense of responsibility is to ourselves, but also to our communities around us. And I wonder how you think we can end up actually doing that at a time when actually economics are basically going backwards and declining for most of our developed economies.
I think that there are people that see the way in which, it's very difficult when you're being actively manipulated to tell exactly what's going on. And I think, but there are people that have had both the clarity, the vision, the courage to analyze this honestly and openly, to spend time studying it, and to realize that, and to also be able to articulate fundamental values. I think that we live in an increasingly nihilistic age in which people believe that there should be no standards beyond absolute, freedom of, like a first year politics conception of freedom of speech. I think about how I'm going to raise my son. I'm really scared about having a son. I think it's hard to raise good boys these days because there's so many pressures on them. I debated once the godfather of modern male supremacism, Rollo Tomassi, on Dr. Phil's show. It's fucking hilarious. And I remember thinking, you are trying to steal from young men their ability to have meaningful relationships and meaningful lives in order to give them these cheap rewards, which actually are ephemeral, meaningless, and leave you nothing more than, a few shags, a few lines of coke, and a lot of booze throughout as your legacy for your life. And I think, the three things I'll teach my kids are to be nice, to be financially stable, and that sometimes delaying gratification is actually the journey to gratification is the thing that's most transformative. It's not the achieving it. And so I think about what those politicians who've thought about this slowly and carefully, they've thought, well, how do we have a society in which, yes, people have the ability to speak, but we also are able to get on with each other. We have a nice society. One in which people understand that to build their lives and their careers takes patience and time and hard work and assiduousness and a little bit of luck along the way. But that's how you build it, not through gambling or crypto or whatever other get-rich-quick scheme comes along. And then the delayed gratification, that you don't need that dopamine right now. Sometimes the pleasure comes from being able to look back at a life and saying, or look back at a moment, or look back on a year and saying, I lived well this year. I feel good about how I've lived this year. And I think that to get there, one of the problems that we have to solve is the problem that I've dedicated the last 9 years of my life to solving. But I think there is a lot of other things that have to be done as well, including conversations like this and people like you who are trying to go out there and think deeply and meaningfully about the problems that we face as nations and individuals. Yeah. So thank you.
Finally, we've got a chat with Alexandra Geser, a German Green MEP who's the EU's top digital policy specialist and architected their landmark Digital Services Act, a regulatory framework to protect democracy in the digital age. But how likely is it for the EU, let alone anyone, to enforce regulation on these US tech giants in a world of Trump's coercive tariffs and flatlining economic growth?
Alexandra Geser, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. Our first ever MEP on the podcast. And I think our first ever Green as well, actually, which is really good for our audience because they're always pushing us to talk to the left. So thank you so much for coming to chat today. We're here at this tech conference in Montreal. A lot of chatter at the moment about how we exercise control. Now, you've been doing a lot of thinking about this, regulation, the R words. How does it feature in a European context? Is it something that we can actually make sure that we're doing to hold these companies accountable?
Well, the regulation is important because, if you're democratically elected, it's your obligation to make sure that people are safe and can thrive. And this is not what is happening if you leave the tech companies to make the rules. There's no such thing as a legislative or a rules vacuum. There's always rules. The question is, do we put them in place as democratically elected policymakers, lawmakers, or do the tech companies decide? The problem with legislation is, first, you need to enforce them. And right now, the threats from the US government are so strong that I think Europe lacks the courage to meaningfully enforce the legislation we have. The other thing is that when you take on social media companies in particular, you need to create a place where people can go from there. So at the same time, you need to build. You can't just try to regulate them because they're so powerful. You need to start building as well. And this is what Maria Ressa talked about, build the technology yourself. And this is what we're also starting to do in Europe.
So there's loads to unpack there. It's like, we've got the rules, they exist.
Yeah.
We can't enforce them. Why can't we enforce them? These companies have such a stranglehold over investment, over growth, over being the technology of the future, such that if you were to try and push back against them, it almost makes you seem like you're living in the past.
No, it's not exactly like that. I think the people are seeing the harms of these tech companies. I mean, many people coming to me and saying, I see so many disinformation in my feeds. My neighbor's going crazy and believes crazy things. So people see that. People see the harms to children. I mean, we listened to mental health. We listened to mother today who lost her son to an AI agent. I think the lack of courage is a higher level. It's really top politicians. And I believe that two different things. One are the narratives that you have been mentioning. So they put up this false contradiction between innovation and regulation. That doesn't exist for me. You can have good or bad regulation. Right. But I mean, the fact we're sitting in the building that doesn't come down is because we have good regulation. The fact that the US have 22 drug-related deaths per 100,000 people and Europe has 2. We can have a lot of innovation with good regulation. I think that goes together. The reason we don't have innovation or we have less innovation is that there's less money in the system and that the people who hold the money in our country are less willing to invest in tech. In my country, Germany, people want to invest in engineering and in the automotive industry and not in tech. Or they want extremely high collateral, which young startups, young people who start a company don't have. So they have to go to the US for the capital. But people don't complain. People who start companies don't complain that much about the regulation. It takes some more time in Germany, that's true, and we have stuff to do there. But they're not saying you shouldn't make AI safe, for example. They're saying, well, I shouldn't have to download the PDF and fill it in and then upload it. That is absurd. That's something we need to change, but that's not a regulation problem. The real problem here is that they are blackmailing us with the tariffs, that the US are saying, well, you enforce your regulation, we are going to slap tariffs on you. And the other thing is you enforce your regulation, your digital regulation, and we are not going to stand by Ukraine. And that is the real big threat and the real blackmail.
And do you think that one of the problems that we've got is the just broader literacy and understanding of this issue, right? You spoke then just about drug deaths as an analogy about we're all aware about how addictive heroin is, but no one's talking about the fact that in some ways what these social media companies are selling us are cigarettes and everyone's addicted to them, but they're not even asking for you to pay them. They're saying, actually, we're making our money elsewhere. It's like tobacco companies also being invested in, I guess, cancer treatments, right, instead. And people don't realize, I guess, that they're the product. How do we change that?
Well, explaining it's not that complicated. I mean, the tobacco industry, that's an analogy that I started using a few years ago, and people are, oh, wow, you're saying social media are as bad as the tobacco industry? So, no, they're so much worse than the tobacco industry. But they learned the playbook. They learned how you do the lobbying, so they invest in universities. They invest in media. They come up with these false studies. Half of the studies that circulate on social media are paid for by the companies themselves, or done by the companies themselves. It's very difficult to do independent research for a university researcher because it doesn't get access to the data. So they are extremely smart about their lobbying. I mean, they do come up to you as a politician and they explain their points, and that is fair. That is what every company does, and it's okay. But pouring all that money into universities and withholding data from researchers they don't like, I don't think that's fair. Putting up fake SME companies and saying, oh, these are real SMEs, but you can't talk to them, you can just talk to me. That is not fair, and I'm not even sure it's legal. Paying the Munich Security Conference to get in a room with the minister and put 10 public affairs people from big tech, but the tag on it is Munich Security Conference. I'm not sure. I think that's borderline. This is not what they should be doing, and this is one of the reasons they have so much influence right now.
Yeah, it's like democracy is clearly for sale in the Trump administration, and then so downstream of that, so are all of our democracies as well, because they're the big superpower, right? And we've in some ways you could argue, and from security now to tech, what's happened in Europe and the UK as well is that they've vacillated, and they've looked at the US and said, well, these guys kind of set the agenda and we just need to copy it. But does Trump strike you as the type of person who is intimidated by that, or does he strike you as the person he thinks there's an opportunity to exploit?
I think he wakes up in the morning and it depends on what the first person says to him. I don't think he's a reliable partner. And I think that is the fault with the trade deal the European Union struck with him, and also UK. Well, how long is this going to last? Well, it's a trade deal that's bad for us. It's bad for the EU. It's bad for UK. Is this really going to work? Are we really going to put our trust in this person, in this authoritarian administration? And we both just listened to Miles Taylor explaining how arbitrary this administration is and how unjust and how it's breaking their own laws. Should those be our partners? I think we should go for partnerships. I think we're drafting ourselves. We're making us smaller than we are. I mean, the European Union is 450 million people. It's enormous amount of purchasing power. And even the tech giants are very interested in operating in this market. Yeah. So if we team up with Canada, since we're in Canada today, Canada's already also being threatened. And if we had teamed up in an early stage with Canada, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Indonesia, with Taiwan, South Korea, Brazil.
That's too many markets for them to ignore.
That's too many markets for them to ignore. Yeah. And if we had just stood our ground and saying, no, we are in favor of free trade, which is not a particularly leftist issue, we just want to keep things as they are, free trade. We defend our democracy. We defend our free press. We're not going to be blackmailed. We're ready to engage you, the legitimately elected president of the United States. We will diplomatically engage, but we will not be blackmailed.
Yeah.
How on earth could we not have won that? Why did nobody think about that?
So basically what you're talking about there is a return in a way to kind of union politics, right? The idea of collective bargaining power, the idea that you can't be shifted because of solidarity, because we recognize that we have mutual shared interests. And the best way to protect those things is to work together. In some ways, the kind of neoliberal order was a triumph over union politics, wasn't it? It was the death of workers to be able to band together and to make sure that they got consequences that were in their interests. It feels almost fanciful, like so far away to imagine a world where we have collaboration on that international stage. Do you think the problem is that governments themselves are thinking, well, maybe if we just play America and China, we'll find a way that for us is going to win or be preferable to others? Or is it just the case of a loss of belief in politics itself that you can do the unthinkable?
I think it's a lack of vision. It felt great to hear the digital minister of Canada yesterday on stage talking about the multilateral rules-based order.
Yeah.
Because
do we remember that?
Yeah, do we remember that? It's like, oh, there's somebody who's still talking about this.
I know, it's true.
It was so great. And then he said, well, and we want still people to come to the country. There was still someone speaking positively about migration, about the contribution that people bring to the country. I mean, it was such an amazing moment, and it should be something so obvious. So I think it's not so far away. I mean, I've had the privilege to live in that multilateral rules-based order for a very, very long time. And it was a good place to be.
Yeah.
At least for somebody born in Germany. I mean, maybe Global South thinks, as he said, a little bit differently, and it would need to be different with different weights without the dominance of Western Europe and the US, obviously. But it's not that we have to reinvent the wheel completely. This was a system that worked great for a lot of people, so we could just revive it a little bit differently, with more drive, with more innovation, with more will to build our own technology. But it's not such a hard thing to do.
Yeah. I think also what's difficult for people to imagine is that the EU, I guess post 2008, has just not been able to match the growth of America, and there's plenty of reasons why that is. But there's this kind of, I think, implicit understanding that that's because Europeans are bandied up by red tape, that we can't do innovation, etc. But we're also seeing in America in crisis right now, and we're seeing a brain drain of talented people from that country come to the EU because, as you've pointed out, we still believe in rules, we still believe in that type of order. Maybe there is a space for us to really try and build out our own stacks, but it's quite hard to see it right now, isn't it? So what is the short-term fix to start getting the right momentum behind belief that we can build and own our own tech?
I like to challenge that narrative that America has had more growth. Yes, it's true. But who does benefit from that growth? A very, very tiny fraction of the population, like 1%. All that growth is concentrated in Silicon Valley, some Texas companies. It's like 0.1% of the population. That's not the kind of growth I want. Growth is not good as such. Growth is good when it benefits the people. And it's not. I mean, every time I go to the US, I'm shocked by the poverty, by the inequality, by the fear people have, people holding down 3 jobs at the time. The taxi driver speaking to me about the loneliness epidemic. And people are lonely because they have to work all the time, because they don't have time to spend with their families, with their friends. Life expectancy in the US is so much lower than on the continent and in Europe, and it's declining. Yeah. I mean, which other indicator could you have that growth is not good for the people living in the US? So the second part of the question, how do we build that tag? It's not that difficult. I mean, you can't do it from one day to the next. The narrative that the tech industry is putting out there is the costs are very high. Yeah, if you want to replicate exactly the same model, the costs are high. But what are the costs going to be if we don't do it? And we get embedded in that AI empire where we are at the periphery. I mean, you had an empire. That was good for UK. It was good for England.
Yeah.
Was it really good for every single colony? I don't think so. And if we let Sam Altman and all these people build their empire, the center's going to be in Texas and in Silicon Valley. And we will all be in the periphery. We will get the data centers. We will get the rising energy prices because obviously somebody has to pay for that energy consumption. We will have the water shortages that some places in the US are already experiencing, that Mexico is experiencing. The places that chose to have their data centers have water issues. That's going to be us, the periphery. So in the long term, the cost will be high if we don't do it. In the short term, what can we do? I mean, I'm a member of the European Parliament, so I also have to look at what can we do at the level of legislation. Well, there's one very simple thing. There's 2 simple things that we are doing. One is we are going to have a recast of the public procurement directives. That is the rules that govern public procurement, so government contracts. And we know that a lot of these companies thrive on government contracts. Palantir, for example, basically built on government contracts. So who do the European governments give taxpayers money to for government contracts? Exactly the same American companies. And in Germany, for example, we have great cloud companies. France has great cloud companies. I'm not sure about UK, but we do have them. And they have a very, very hard time getting government contracts. So that is something we need to change. So what we are thinking is in the upcoming review of this public procurement rules to put a clause in that if you have a European company who can do that, provide the same service at the same price, gets priority. Because what happens now is exactly the contrary. So this is what they need. They need a steady flow of demand, which is exactly what US companies have. And a lot of that can come from government at different levels. And then the private industry can follow suit because this attracts capital. The moment investors know these companies have steady government demand, they will be ready to invest. So that's one strategy. The second one, still on cloud, is we have a piece of legislation coming up that's called the Cloud and AI Development Act. And one of the things we can do there is define what kind of data do we want to have with European companies. Because if you have your data on a US hyperscaler, President Trump has access. There's something called the Cloud Act in the US. And that means the government has access to any kind of data that is stored or processed by an American company or a company that has Americans on the board somewhere in the property. We know that in the US, they're going after women who have abortion in other states. And then they use data to find that. They use their menstrual cycle apps, and they ask the data companies to provide the data. So for me as a politician, I have to protect the people from having that kind of access for the American government. Another example is military data. You know, what happens if President Trump in the end decides to team up with Vladimir Putin and to threaten our borders? I think the military data should be with European companies where it is safe. This is the minimum we could do, and that would also create a steady flow of demand. So that would help the cloud computing companies, and that would also help AI, because that means a lot of investment goes into good data centers, and you can some of them that are very specific for AI. So let's come up with really, really edge-cutting applications. For example, for medicine, for our industry, Germany still has a very heavy mechanical engineering basis. So let's come up with applications that are very specific for that and that are maybe even more advanced. I mean, I'm visiting companies in Germany that have amazing technology. They just don't have the same amount of capital. But if we make sure they get that capital, I think in 10 years' time, we can be at the forefront of this.
You're very interesting, Green, insofar as you consider data centers as something that we're going to have to wrestle with, which is just interesting, right? Because there's a lot of people out there who are concerned about their energy consumption, about the use of fresh water to cool them, etc. But I think what you strike me as someone who's very pragmatic about the fact that this tech is here to stay, right? Like, we're just in a position where we need to know how to harness it effectively to be able to return agency to citizens rather than take it away from them. Is there anything that gives you a little bit of hope right now?
Yes, the fact that a lot of people in Europe are building technology right now. We're going to see the next month a presentation of a European platform for social media, which is called Eurosky Social. That gives me a lot of hope. We've seen Maria Ressa's project. There's a lot of people really building the tech and building it with the idea in mind that it's not going to be a niche product for people who are particularly aware. This is something we have always had, but they're building it with the idea of scaling it up to be a real alternative to the tech giants. That is something that's giving me hope. And also the fact that an increasing number of people is aware of the harms, hates the polarization that goes with social media, is very concerned about the lack of media pluralism and media freedom, and really wants to fight for this. So I think the two things together, there's a lot of hope.
Alexandra Lisa, thank you so much.
That's been a bit mad, isn't it? Like, some of the most incredibly smart people I've ever met in my entire life, and I'm trying to make sense of what the hell is left with them. I mean, it's honestly the maddest privilege is doing this job and getting to learn a little bit more every single day about the way the world is moving. Now, I know a few of you are going to be a bit alarmed, maybe a bit concerned, a little bit upset after the stuff that we've heard today. Yeah, me too. You know, it's definitely a scary, scary world that we're moving into. But there are a few things that I think we need to take away. Number one, We need to raise the literacy about these issues. We need people to know, to listen, to hear what is actually going on inside these massive companies who have absolutely zero democratic scrutiny on their behavior and their actions. Yes, they've got the money, but we've got the power. We are still the people at the end of the day who can ensure that there's a level of control over what these people do. And the only way we're going to do that is if we embrace regulation, right? My cameraman Sam just said something really interesting, which is completely true, which is that we had people of all sorts of political stripes on this podcast in this episode, yet every single one of them agreed that the level of accountability that tech has right now is completely insufficient. That we need to make sure that we regulate and we exercise some control over these companies. Otherwise, they're just going to do what they've always done and get away with it. It's not the world of freedom, of the ability to really shape who you are when a tech company has all your data and is manipulating the things that you can see and you believe are true about this world. Whether you're left or right, you should be thinking that now is the moment to make change happen and ensure that these companies are properly held accountable. But I think that this issue is one that you can't be quiet about anymore, because we can see around us, our society is more polarized than ever before, and people have never found it more difficult to have solidarity. That's not a world that I think that we should be living in, and I don't think we have to. It's time to take back control.